We are celebrating the 2025 Lee Bennett Hopkins Poetry Award for Children winner, Counting Winter, by Nancy White Carlstrom, illustrated by Claudia McGahey. Counting Winter is the 32nd winner of the Hopkins Award that began in 1993, and this prestigious award is the oldest children's poetry award of its kind. Nancy White Carlstrom, thank you for joining me today to talk about your exceptional title.
Well, thank you, Ellysa. It's an honor to be with you.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here with you. So I want to start off today by acknowledging our jury chair, Carla Schmidt, and I want to thank her for providing questions for today's video. And Carla encouraged us to begin this video by sharing what her 2025 jury said about Counting Winter. They said, a sensory delight for young children and adults alike. Ms. Carlstrom's poetry for children was a standout. Counting Winter showcases melodic, expressive poetry that portrays the serenity and wonder of Alaska's winter landscape. Her succinct verses incorporate striking imagery and subtle repetition, establishing a gentle rhythm that echoes the movements of the animals she depicts and the chilly winter weather that she describes. What a great description from our jury. And building on that beautiful description, could you tell us how the idea for this book emerged?
Well, like most of my work, it started with real experience. Living in the far north in Fairbanks, Alaska was an amazing experience for me as a writer. So a lot of my work, just grows out of where I live, what I do, what I see, the wonders of the world that I experience. And Counting Winter was that way too.
And you definitely captured the wonders of the world in Counting Winter for sure, and the wonder of Alaska. So many books for young people feature barnyard animals. And what the jury really loved about Counting Winter is that children are introduced to animals that they may not be aware of or know that much about. So how did you go about choosing the animals that are depicted in the book?
Well, again, these are all animals that have ties to that specific area. I didn't include all of them because I had already done some books on some of the others that are more common. But yeah, they were animals that I saw in some shape or form almost daily.
So then, because it's a counting book, how did you decide how many of each animal would be featured? And did the writing of the verse drive that decision for you?
Some of that was worked out with the illustrator. And also just, I think part of that was a design issue too, which normally I don't have that much say on the design. But in this case, I did email with Claudia a bit about some of the animals that she was not as familiar with. A lot of these, she experiences in where she lives.
Where does Claudia live?
She lives in Iowa,
That's
but
really
she has ties to the Pacific Northwest. And also she has really grown a lot more comfortable with the animals of Alaska too.
That is really interesting. So, you talked a little bit about how you worked with Claudia. Could you describe for us your writing process? And in general, when you have an idea for a book, how do you get started with it and start to proceed?
All of my books have started with either a title or some kind of phrase that sort of caught my fancy. And I would, back in the beginning of my 40-year career, I would just jot it down longhand. And then I would never work on it right away. I might keep a folder on it or later, a folder on the computer, but would tell students when I did school programs, it was like cooking a pot of stew on the back burner. I would toss in ideas and it would simmer away. And I really wouldn't actually work on the poem or story until it seemed ready.
So that happened with Counting Winter. You thought about it and then you just kind of let it simmer for a while?
Yes. And I later found some of my longhand jottings and had a lot of different animals than I used. And yeah, it was quite different in the beginning.
That's a unique process. And so once you started to get into this then and really, working on the flow of the book, how did you go about coming up with that pattern through an exploration with writing words? Did it formulate in your mind? mind as you thought about the writing? Or did you have a combination of strategies that helped that pattern evolve?
Not really strategies, but well, I guess for me, usually it's more, I start with many more words than I need. And then it's sort of a cutting away process. So I pare it down kind of to the bare minimum. And then if I need to add, or maybe I did want to have some internal rhyming or something, I would go ahead and try that. I also always read aloud everything that I write to get the cadence, the rhythm of it.
Was this an easy book to write compared to some of your other books?
I don't know.
Like, did it just all did it just all spill out, or was it something where you really were working incrementally?
Well, again, I sort of thought it had all spilled out, but then when I looked at the notes from years ago, I again noticed I had started with a lot more words than I needed. Each poem or book is different. It's hard to say which is easier or quicker. I always loved this, and it came so directly from our living in Fairbanks and what I remembered that was so different from where we were living here in Seattle at the time when we moved. And there was such a closeness to nature that I felt there.
So, how many years in the making was this book? Because you just referred to years. And like, when did you first think of it? And then how
Well,
long did it take to evolve?
well, honestly, I probably wrote the book 20 years ago, and I just, I hadn't sent it out. I mean, it was only when I was working with Erdman's on something else, and I said, I still have some manuscripts that are still in my file drawer. So that's when I sent them Counting Winter. But, I never would have chosen Claudia's art, but I'm so, her art is stunning. And it just made the book come alive in a different way. And the whole process, in some ways, I guess I could say this was one of the most interesting processes of doing a book that I've ever had, because their vision of it was so much different than my original vision.
How was it different, Nancy?
I guess when I first wrote it, I think and when I say 20 years, I mean, that's when I first put down, or first started that simmering bowl of stew. I mean, I worked on it. Well, I can't tell you the last year I worked on it, but what was so amazing was that I envisioned it as much younger. And so I didn't see that it could be, something for older kids. And so my vision was certainly broadened by the design team, the editors, the artist, everybody who was working on it really saw this, the possibility of making this an older book. When I say older, like up to, well, I don't know what the age range is. I think it's 5 to 8 or something. So, but I'm delighted at the outcome. And of course, yeah.
It's hard to imagine your book without Claudia's art.
I know it is. Yeah, it's stunning art. And I'm just so pleased. I was pleased and continue to be pleased by that.
Well, on that topic, I have a question for you about Claudia's art. So, the illustrations in Counting Winter are a perfect fusion with what the text is describing. And the muted watercolors and scratchboard technique with the double page spreads add to that feeling of winter and icy cold temperatures in Alaska. How was the illustrator Claudia McGahey chosen? And you said that the vision for the book was different. Did you have input into what the illustrations would be like?
I don't know how she was chosen, actually, because I was not involved in it at that point. However, they did ask me if I had seen, she had done one book that was, at least one, that was scratchboard that was set in Alaska. And so I was familiar with that, and I really liked that. So I guess the fact that, I liked that, I mean, that was input.
Was that other book that you mentioned, was that My Wilderness and Alaskan Adventure, right?
Right.
I can see the similarities. That's really interesting.
Uh-huh.
And maybe how they landed on Claudia as the perfect
Right.
person for
Oh,
this.
yeah. And I
So
love that book because I knew right where, my one son still lives in Alaska, and they go to that area. So that was very special.
So you mentioned, earlier in our conversation about talking with Claudia about, the different animals for, specific numbers. And were you talking with Claudia actively about developing the illustrations too, as she was working, through the book?
Well, no, not so much the actual illustrations, because it is a separate job for the illustrator. I mean, in some ways, this was more collaboration. I mean, a lot of times I don't see anything until the book is finished.
This was more collaborative, it sounds like,
A little
than
bit.
that's really interesting because I never thought about that an author, when you write the text, that you may not get to really play a heavy hand in the
Mm-hmm.
illustrations
Mm-hmm.
development too. It's interesting to know that.
Well, hopefully the words themselves give the illustrator, enough of an idea to go in the creative direction that they want to go in.
So I have another related question to that. So, a little more about the design process. So the overall design of Counting Winter really lends itself well to a title that would be used by teachers in the schools and
Mm-hmm.
in so many different curricular and interactive ways. But then it also is absolutely a title that families would enjoy reading aloud. And the book includes a section called Animal Profiles with additional information on each creature and has an author's note and an illustrator note. And these sections are not always included in a picture book format, although it's
Mm-hmm.
wonderful when they are, and especially not in a book with poetic verses. So tell us a little more about that design process and perhaps even like the decision making that went into developing those additional sections, that kind of thing.
Again, that was more the design team and working with Claudia. And that's part of the what I said about their vision was a lot greater than mine because I would not have come up with those things myself. And even when I first heard about them, it was like, oh, I don't know about this, but I think it made it. And hopefully that's what a real marriage of author and illustrator, a successful book is when it works so well that it's bigger than the vision that either one had, the finished art and project.
I think what you're speaking to is really the magic of a great editor and a great publisher, right? That they are
Right.
maximizing both partners in the process, the writer
Mm-hmm.
and the illustrator, to make something, like you said, bigger than you ever envisioned come to life.
Right.
So, speaking of that team, who is involved in all of those book design decisions? Is that entirely on the publisher's side, or are you involved too? And how long did it take to get to the final version of this book?
It was at such a difficult time for me that it was, going through my husband's medical crises and then his death just a year ago. We're coming up on that on Monday. It was like a gift to me in the midst of all I was going through because I was able to do that and, have a little distraction from the difficulties we were having here. So now looking back, it's kind of a blur, tell you the truth. It was a process though. It was more than just, I didn't go back to try to figure it out at this point. But anyway, it was a really good experience.
And it sounds like it was really just sort of a ever evolving process, that it just was unfolding with the book
Right.
itself. And I have one additional question for you, Nancy, which is an important one in the context of this award. Did you ever have an opportunity to meet the fantastic Lee Bennett Hopkins? His legacy lives on with the award he founded. And of course, you are now forever part of that impressive group of poets.
As far as I can remember, I mean, of course, I knew of his books for many years, but I met him in person once in 1998 when we had the same agent, Marilyn Marlowe, and there was a surprise party for her back in New York City. And I went, and then later afterwards went to a small dinner event where Lee was there. So I do remember meeting him, and he was so kind and gracious, and I had such a good memory of being at that event. I'm just so honored to be part of this legacy.
I know if Lee were here, he would be bubbling over with joy and enthusiasm at the selection of your book for the Lee Bennett Hopkins Poetry Award. And, the criteria for the Hopkins Award says good poetry is imaginative. It deals with emotion and it has significance beyond the act of creation. It uses figurative language yet is compact in thought and expression. Good poetry has an element of beauty and truth, which appears unstable outside of the poem. And the book which wins the Lee Bennett Hopkins Poetry Award for children's poetry must be accessible to children, and its presentation must serve the poem or poems in an attractive and appropriate manner. Counting Winter embodies every element of this criteria, and it is particularly special because it is poetry for young children. The world of children's poetry is richer because of Counting Winter and because of you, Nancy White Carlstrom. Congratulations.